In the fall of 1863, Abraham Lincoln dedicated the National Cemetery at Gettysburg to the memory of the men who died here in the first 3 days of July, giving what he called the last full measure of devotion. Those were among the most critical days in American history. A Southern victory at Gettysburg could have turned the tide of the Civil War and permanently altered the course of the Union. Almost by chance, the sleepy little town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania became the stage for a furious battle involving over 160,000 men. In 3 bloody days, the place and the men made their mark on history. Hello, I'm Stacy Keach, and I hope you'll join me and the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, the late Bruce Catton, for a closer look at the turning point of the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg.
The Battle of Gettysburg was, in a way, accidental. The armies ran into each other there. They had not especially planned to meet there. Lee was on an invasion of the North, looking for a favorable place to make the Union Army fight at a disadvantage. Meade was groping blindly, trying to find the Army of Northern Virginia. Meade's troops went to Gettysburg because the road Meade was following led there. Lee had picked Gettysburg as a place to concentrate his army, simply because the road from the east, where half his army was, met the road from the west, where the other half was, at the Gettysburg crossroads. So they collided, and the 3-day battle was the result.
The initial collision was between 2 Union cavalry brigades under Brigadier General John Buford and advance elements of a Confederate infantry division under the command of Major General Henry Heath, making a second effort at procuring much-needed shoes in Gettysburg. By 7 a.m. on July 1st, in a light drizzle, the great battle had begun. Buford's 2,200 dismounted cavalrymen were fighting a gallant holding action against superior numbers, waiting for support from the Union First Corps under General John Reynolds. Buford watched their approach from the cupola of the Lutheran Seminary, which gave Seminary Ridge its name. He wondered if they would arrive in time, as he could also see more Confederate troops approaching from the north. The Union lines were on the verge of collapse when the First Corps arrived on the scene, and Reynolds decided to hold the position and rode off to deploy the Union troops pouring into the area. His decisions affected the outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg far beyond his lifetime. While he was directing deployment of the famed Iron Brigade of General Solomon Meredith, Reynolds was shot in the head, as the story goes, by a sharpshooter in a tree overhead. The 42-year-old general was dead before he hit the ground. The command passed to Abner Doubleday, and the fighting continued along the lines established by Reynolds until just after noon, when the Union 11th Corps arrived. Corps Commander Major General Oliver Howard took command and made one critical decision. He stationed reserves on Cemetery Hill, separated from the fighting by the town of Gettysburg. This position saved the day for the Federals, as the Southern infantry poured into battle all afternoon, with fresh divisions arriving from the north and west. These Southern troops appeared mostly by chance in perfect battle positions just when they were most needed, outnumbering the Federals by 10,000 men. Fate was indeed smiling on the South that day, and by late afternoon, over 10,000 Federals were killed, wounded, or captured, and the shattered remnants were retreating through the town to positions on Cemetery Hill. Robert E. Lee watched the disorganized flight of his adversaries from here in the seminary cupola. He was confident that an overwhelming victory was within reach, and he sent word to his corps commander, Richard Baldy Ewell, that it was only necessary to press these people in order to secure possession of the heights. And if possible, he wished General Ewell to do this. If possible. Typical of General Lee, the orders were vague and left a lot to the discretion of the receiver. Unfortunately for Ewell's reputation, he exercised more discretion than valor that day. One of his divisions had suffered heavy casualties. A second was still disorganized from their pursuit of the Federals through town. Ewell was tired and on unfamiliar ground, and he decided to wait for the arrival of his 3rd Division, still on the march. It was dusk when it finally came up, and by then, the opportunity had passed. And with it, the Southern hope that Dick Ewell would turn out to be another Stonewall Jackson. On the other side of the coin was Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, whose statue dominates the crest of Cemetery Hill. He arrived on the scene in mid-afternoon under orders to take charge of the situation. Hancock was an energetic, self-assured leader, and he took command over the protests of Howard, who was technically his superior, and restored calm to the chaos on Cemetery Hill. He ordered Doubleday to take position on Culp's Hill with what was left of the 1st Corps, and solidified the line south from Cemetery Hill, held by the remains of Buford's cavalry. Now, any Confederate assault on the hill would have met with failure. At any rate, none came. Hancock's position was secure, and the first day's fighting was over. The remaining troops of both armies converged on Gettysburg, with Meade finally taking personal charge and extending Hancock's line south along Seminary Ridge, completing what has come to be known as the fishhook configuration, a position that would prove impenetrable over the next 2 days, among the bloodiest in history. The ground for the decisive battle of the Civil War had been chosen. The Union line was to be anchored on the south by the 3rd Corps, under the command of Major General Daniel Sickles. The extreme left of his line was to be at the base of a rocky hill called Little Round Top. From here, on the top of the hill, you can see most of the field of battle, down the Union line clear to Cemetery Hill. It's a commanding position, but one whose significance seems to have been missed by just about everyone on the field. Sickles was an ex-congressman from New York, arrogant and impetuous, a key player in the events of July 2nd. His leg was shattered by a cannonball near his headquarters at the farm of Abraham Trossel. The farm was littered with bodies of dead horses following a desperate stand by the 9th Massachusetts Artillery. The New England battery took heavy casualties and lost 4 of its 6 artillery pieces. But it held off the advance of General William Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade long enough to allow the Union forces to establish a new line. This action was late in a day so devastating that the 3rd Corps would never fight as a unit again. Sickles' actions earlier in the day had pressed the fighting. Without orders, actually in spite of orders to the contrary, he advanced to what he considered to be a better position. He moved his corps clear up to the Emmitsburg Road with a sharp angle at the Sherfy Peach Orchard, and the left of the line bent back along a low ridge anchored at the foot of Little Round Top by a lower hill made up of giant boulders, aptly known as Devil's Den. Sickles was now detached from the rest of the Union line, with both his flanks exposed, along with that of Hancock's 2nd Corps on Cemetery Ridge. Confederate Corps Commander James Longstreet spent most of the day getting his men into position and trying to talk Lee into circling the Round Tops and attacking the Union from the rear. But Lee's orders were to attack up the Emmitsburg Road. And at 4 o'clock, the assault began. Now, it was too late for Meade to pull Sickles back to his assigned position. So he brought in troops from other parts of the field to support the fight, already heating up. The shortcomings of Sickles' new position were immediately apparent. Artillery pounded his line, and Confederates swarmed into it from 2 directions. Hood's division attacked the southern end of the line. They captured Devil's Den and pushed on to the wheat field, which has been called the whirlpool of the battle. Here, hour after hour, regiments from both armies poured into the fighting. The wheat field changed hands no less than 6 times that afternoon. When it was over, the entire area was littered with bodies from both sides. The trampled wheat was covered with blood, and the streams flowed red. The 2nd Confederate Division, McLaws, attacked the northern end of the 3rd Corps salient at the Peach Orchard and north along the Emmitsburg Road. The Union lines broke again, and only heroics like those of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, with 82% casualties, and Meade's well-placed and timely reinforcements kept the Union position from being cut in half. The Union left of July 2nd was one of the only parts of the battlefield on which bodies remained on July 6th when the first photographers arrived. The level of carnage gave rise to such vivid nicknames as the Slaughter Pen, Bloody Run, and the Valley of Death. The bloated corpses awaiting burial provide graphic evidence of the fighting that day. Fighting described so well by Lieutenant Frank Haskell of the Union 2nd Corps. To see the fight while it went on in the valley below us was terrible. What must it be now when we are in it, and it is all around us in all its fury? All senses, for the time, are dead but the one of sight. The roar of the discharges and the yell of the enemy all pass unheeded. But the impassioned soul is all eyes and sees all things that the smoke does not hide. So the Union left was pretty well crushed, and what remained of Sickles' Corps fell back to Cemetery Ridge. A great Confederate victory was once again within Lee's grasp. All the rebels had to do was to take Little Round Top, and they would be in position to command all of the ridge and devastate the Union line with enfilading fire. This is the stuff of which heroes are made. When Hood's division began its assault on Devil's Den early in the day's action, Little Round Top was occupied only by a small detachment of the Union Signal Corps. Meade's chief engineer, General Gouverneur Warren, was there too, and he saw the Confederates advancing through the woods below. He realized the key held by Little Round Top and sent word to General George Sykes of the 5th Corps, who ordered reinforcements. A 26-year-old colonel, Strong Vincent, answered the call with about 1,350 men. They arrived barely in time to defend Little Round Top against the first wave of charging rebels. Strong Vincent fell mortally wounded early in the fighting. Then there was Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and his 360 men of the 20th Maine. They defended the far left of the Union line against Colonel William Oates and the 15th Alabama. The 20th Maine fought against superior numbers until they ran out of ammunition. Then they fixed bayonets and charged down this hill into the oncoming Confederates. The previously undefeated 15th Alabama was taken by surprise and routed. Some surrendered, some ran for their lives. To quote Colonel Oates, "There were never harder fighters than the 20th Maine men and their gallant colonel. His skill and persistency and the great bravery of his men saved Little Round Top and the Army of the Potomac from defeat. Great events sometimes turn on comparatively small affairs." The story was similar on the Union right. Ewell's orders were to demonstrate against the forces on Culp's Hill, his attack to be coordinated with Longstreet's assault on the left. He was about an hour late and not very successful. The Confederates assumed the breastworks at the base of the hill, abandoned by the Union 12th Corps in support of Sickles on the opposite front. But General George Greene's brigade of New Yorkers were dug in on the summit, and the rebel charges were repeatedly repulsed. They ended around 11 o'clock, with both sides fighting in the smoky darkness, the flashes of gunfire the only light. One attack on Cemetery Hill met with disaster when the Confederates advanced from the woods right in front of a Union artillery battery with devastating results. A second brigade, the Louisiana Tigers, led by General H.T. Hayes, made it up this part of Cemetery Hill and captured a few of the Union guns here. But it was getting dark, and the expected support troops never came. The two gallant brigades of Confederates were forced to yield the ground that had cost 600 casualties to acquire. Although the second day resulted in 65% of the Union's casualties, it was a case of too little, too late. And for the second time in as many days, the sweet taste of victory had eluded Robert E. Lee.
One thing we often overlook is the emotional human price that was paid by various people for the division that took place in 1861. Take the officers of the regular army, some of them from the north, some of them from the south. They found themselves called upon to make a choice. And there was a southern captain, a man named Armistead, whose best friend was a northern captain named Hancock. And one night there was a farewell party. The two sat nearby each other with an evening of song and strained laughter. And one of the women present finally got up to sing the little song that would mark their parting. She sang Kathleen Mavourneen. You know, it may be for years and it may be forever. And when the song finished, Armistead got up with tears going down his cheeks and put his hands on Hancock's shoulder and said, "You'll never know what this has cost me. Goodbye." Well, they went their ways. Armistead went south, Hancock went north. Each man became a general. They did not see each other again. At Gettysburg, on the 3rd of July, 1863, the Union Army was on Seminary Ridge, and the man in command there was General Hancock. Pickett's division was attacking that particular spot, and the man in command of the spearhead of the attacking force was General Armistead. And he and his men came up the slope. Armistead with his felt hat on the tip of his sword, holding it aloft as a guide for the men that were following him. You can't help wondering, it may be for years and it may be forever. The old friends were coming together at last. They had their appointment. As a matter of fact, they both got shot. Hancock survived his wound. Armistead broke through the line of Hancock's infantry, got his hands on the muzzle of one of Hancock's cannon, and then died.
When Armistead fell among these guns, he handed his watch to Hancock's aide with the words, "Tell General Hancock that I know I did my country a great wrong when I took up arms against her, for which I am sorry, but for which I cannot live to atone." This, according to our friend Frank Haskell, who was in the thick of things on July 3rd during the bloody and climactic Pickett's charge. While the events of the first 2 days at Gettysburg were extremely complicated, this day's carnage was tragically simple. At around 1 o'clock, with over 12,000 men massed in the woods on Seminary Ridge, the Confederate gunners began a magnificent bombardment. It was designed to break up the line of some 6,000 Federals on Cemetery Ridge and put their artillery out of commission. It did neither. The Union soldiers were uncomfortable but relatively safe behind their low stone walls. The Confederates overshot the mark, doing more damage to Meade's headquarters than to the Union line. And the Union artillery commander, General Henry Hunt, wisely kept plenty of guns and ammunition in reserve and lost very little firepower. A captain in the Union artillery said, Viewed as a display of fireworks, the rebel practice was entirely successful. But as a military demonstration, it was the biggest humbug of the season. When the cannonade stopped, it was General Longstreet who had the unenviable job of ordering the infantry charge. He had advised against it. He believed it would fail, and he didn't want to do it. But it was by Lee's orders, so he did. Wave after wave of Confederate men came out of the woods and set out steadily and uncharacteristically quietly across the field to converge on their distant objective, the center of the Union's Second Corps line, marked by a little clump of trees. It was an impressive sight. But in the next half hour, 60% of the men who began the charge would be killed, wounded, or captured. Union batteries on Little Round Top and Cemetery Hill and Ridge began to thin the ranks almost immediately. There was no defense against this fire, and the rebels closed ranks and pressed onward. And the closer they got, the more devastating the defensive fire became. Union infantry fire could hardly miss once the Confederates were in range, and the Federals advanced on both flanks, their fire hitting the oncoming rebels from three sides. Still they came. Within 500 yards, the most deadly weapon was artillery canister. The loads were like a coffee can filled with steel balls about the size of golf balls, called canned hellfire. It could cut down a whole company of men in a single shot. Still they came. Armistead led some 200 men over the wall, and hand-to-hand combat among the Union guns resulted in a tangled mass of confusion, the final effort of the Confederates at Gettysburg, the beginning of the end. Off in the distance, Lee rallied the retreating infantry, consoling them and praising their gallant effort, saying, "It's all my fault."
The position was too strong, and the Union men fought that day as they had never fought before. Pickett's division was wrecked. Lee's army had to retreat, and did retreat back to Virginia. The Confederate high water mark had been reached and passed. From then on, it was on a downhill slope. Vicksburg fell the same day Gettysburg was lost. The two Union victories together made the outcome of the war almost inevitable. Almost, because the Union people could always get tired of the war and quit, and came fairly close to doing it in the summer of 1864. But from a military point of view, the Confederacy was doomed after the high water mark had been passed. And Gettysburg marked the beginning of a long, painful, expensive end.
As Lee slipped back to Virginia, escaping the final destruction so dearly desired by Abraham Lincoln, the burial squads were completing their grim work. Total loss in dead, wounded, missing, or captured was 27% for the North, 30% for the South. 45,000 in all. 45,000 Americans removed from a war that was to take another 2 years' toll on a divided country. Some were more proficient than others, some were braver than others, but for the most part, they were amateur soldiers. Speaking of the Union dead, Lincoln said that they gave their lives that the nation might live. It's this last full measure of devotion that we've remembered these 120 years, along with the equal devotion of their Southern counterparts.
Now, the touching thing about these amateur civilian soldiers is that they finally acquired, if not discipline, at least the ability to stand in an ordered, ruler-straight regimental front. Go to any Civil War battlefield in our country, and you'll see the cemeteries and the gravestones laid out rank upon rank, perfectly straight, perfect formation. At last, these boys got into a proper military formation. You stand there and you look at them and your eyes get somewhat misty. And you look for a proper epitaph. The best one I know was actually written by an English poet, but it applies to, I think, all soldiers of all armies. It goes like this. Here dead we lie, because we did not choose to live and shame the land from which we sprung. Life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose. But young men think it is. And we were young.
I'm Stacy Keach. Thank you for joining us. Good night.